Chapter 36, Cinderella. The maid who came to deliver the message was originally imposing, because she knew that the master mother was angry, and guessed that Jiang Xuning was afraid that there would be no good fruit to eat, so she was quite polite when she spoke to her, but when she left, she was pale and softened, because she was frightened by Jiang Xuning's undisguised threat, and she was even more afraid of how to convey these words to Meng Shi after returning for a while. Lianer and Tang thought that their second girl had a good temper during this time, and she was becoming more and more reasonable and peaceful. Where did you expect such a thing to suddenly come out? Both of them were taken aback, and when they served her again, they inevitably felt a little more trembling, and they were still a little worried. Second girl, Madam is the head of the house after all, will this be? Jiang Xuning ripped off the handkerchief on her face, and threw it into the copper basin in front of her. A pink face faintly fainted with a little heat and smoked red, becoming more and more tender like a freshly peeled egg, and the plain face was also clear and clear, without the cover and modification of makeup. The delicacy and excellence of the facial features became more and more obvious. She said, "Isn't this my home too? Besides, she still has to enter the palace for half a year. How can she say that she is also the companion of the eldest princess now, although she doesn't like this identity, and she doesn't like her current situation, but even if Meng Shi is annoyed, what can she do? Meng Shi loves Jiang Suiwei and will inevitably throw a mouse." After she finished washing, she asked Lianer to make a pot of tea, and instructed Tang, "Miss Yu from Bafa will come over in a while. You find a clever mouth and keep an eye on the concierge more, don't let people stop the door casually." This time, he could only stay at home for 2 days when he left the palace. To instruct Yu Fangyan again, and clean up the beginnings and tails left after the last instruction of her, there is not much time left for Jiang Xuning. Not to mention the matter of Yan Lin's side. Originally, although the time for the accident in the Yanji Marquis mansion was gradually approaching, after all, there was still a while. She could use it slowly, give Yan Lin enough foreshadowing and preparation, and then make it clear to him, maybe he could accept it better. In this way, I won't hate her as much as I did in my previous life. But the plan was all disrupted by the fact that he entered the palace to read with him. If you enter the palace, it must be inconvenient to act, and you don't dare to say anything in the palace, but it will take 10 days to leave the palace again. If you don't take advantage of this time to make it clear, I'm afraid that in the future, I am afraid that there will be no chance to speak. **. When she got up early in the morning, Yu Fangyan quietly stuffed a small piece of broken silver into the porter who was familiar with her. Because the skirt was simple, she didn't need to be disguised, she looked like a maid in the house. And it's still not very decent. She slipped out of the house, and as she walked out the door, she looked around carefully, as if she was afraid that someone would follow her. But in fact, this kind of hope does not make any sense. If someone really wants to follow them, how can they be discovered so easily? Like what? At the moment when she walked out of Qing Yuan Bafo, next to the wonton stall not far from the side of the road, a young man in blue who was not amazing gently put down his chopsticks, took out a few copper plates from his waist, rested them on the greasy small table, and got up and went far away. Dayakan had already scolded in his heart at this time. The surnamed Lu would call Mr. Lu's subordinates all day long, and he couldn't see them idle. He actually found such a drudgery as being with people. What is there to follow a little Bafa girl? If you let the brothers know, I'm afraid that I don't think that Master Dao is an obscene person in the poor streets and alleys. Yu Fangyan crossed 2 streets and entered a silk shop. Dayakan watched from the upstairs not far away, and after a while, she saw her come out with a fine Hangzhou silk. At this point, he didn't feel anything. But after a while, Yu Fangyan walked into a pen and ink shop again, and bought 2 good pens, one with a good inkstone, followed by rouge gouache, and also went in to buy some, and when he came out, he was sent out by the boss's smiling face, and then the head of the jewelry, and so on. In the end, I went to the temple to ask for a peace charm. The corners of Dayakan's mouth finally couldn't help twitching. This uncle's concubine used to live a poor life, and suddenly she got a lot of money because of the raw silk business, and she must have to treat herself well. And looking at these things bought, all of them are for the daughter's family. The surnamed Lu opened her mouth and said that she would definitely go to her owner. This posture looks like it's going to the owner? For a moment, he wanted to lose the task, turned around and went back to the house to complain to Mr. Just say that the mouth surnamed Lu talks nonsense all day long, and none of the predictions are accurate. But the next moment he realized that something was wrong. This Yu Fangyan had already hired a carriage halfway through the road, and after coming out of the temple, he got into the carriage and said a word to the coachman. It stands to reason that it's time to go home. But the sword and piano archery skills are excellent, and a pair of eyes are even more eyesight, and he can see the feathers on the birds 10 jong away, and he can easily see the shape of Yu Fangyan's lips when he speaks. That's definitely not the words Qing Yuan Bafo. Dayakan's heart froze, and he immediately put away his previous contempt for this task, and silently observed the whereabouts of the carriage, sometimes hurrying, sometimes taking shortcuts, and in a short time saw the carriage far bypass a mansion and stop in front of the side door of the house that was open to the east. Yu Fangyan stepped out of the car. Dayakan raised his head and looked at the plaque hanging on the door of this mansion, and almost bit his tongue off in shock. Good. I'm afraid my husband's head is going to be bigger. Asterisk. Miss Yu, please come in. Because of Zhang Xunning's instructions before, the concierge had already prepared, so Tanger got the news of Yu Fangyan's visit, so he hurriedly went to pick up the person and brought it to Zhang Xunning's house, first stepped forward to open the curtain, and then reported to the inside. Second girl, people are here. Zhang Xunning's place of residence is much more beautiful than Yu Fangyan's shabby house. After she came back, she has cleaned up and adjusted for a period of time, removed some unsuitable furnishings, and added some more suitable objects, which has become more and more fragrant and soft. The Boshan furnace on the case is also lit with a clear fragrance of tuck incense. Yu Fangyan almost looked straight when she walked in. Zhang Xuning didn't wear shoes in her room, she was barefoot, she didn't even comb her hair, she just sat cross-legged on the kong by the window in a casual and lazy attitude, drinking tea and reading a book at the same time. I just remembered that I wanted to see Yan Lin in the evening, and I couldn't turn a page for a long time. When she heard someone coming, she looked up. Sure enough, it was the same as what she pointed out yesterday, dressed up very inconspicuously, and bought a lot of things, so she nodded and smiled, and only said, "It's still early, sit down." Yu Fangyan saluted her first, but she refused to sit opposite Zhang Xuning no matter what. Tanger had no choice but to move an embroidery pier for her. This time, she sat down under Zhang Xuning, and only said, "The second girl is my savior, just sit here." Zhang Xuning wanted to persuade her, but when she thought about it, she was uncomfortable in front of her, and if she sat opposite her, she might be so nervous that she couldn't even speak, so she just stopped. He said, "How was it when you came?" Yu Fang groaned, "I did what the girl said, and I looked left and right when I went out, but I really didn't see anyone following me." If you can find out, the person who is following you is too stupid. Zhang Xuning couldn't help laughing, nodded, and asked Tanger to bring her the tea, and said, "Anyway, you can do what I say, as for what will happen later, you have to wait and see. I called you here today to see that you were quite self-motivated yesterday, and since you want to make more money, you naturally have to have a way to make money. So before you come, I've prepared a little bit and have a few ideas I want to tell you. Yu Fangyan's eyes widened in surprise. Tanger came up with tea at this time. While thinking about how to answer, she hurriedly reached out to pick it up, but suddenly forgot that she still had a wound on her hand, and when she took the teacup, she inadvertently touched it, and the sudden pain made her tremble her hand, and almost exclaimed. Smack! The teacup was not steady, and it suddenly fell to the ground and shattered. Tea splashed everywhere, wetting people's dresses. Tanger was startled, and looked at Yu Fangyan with a surprised gaze. Miss Yu, are you okay? No, I'm fine. Yu Fangyan grabbed the fingers of her other hand with one of her hands. Her face was full of panic and crampedness. She didn't expect that she had knocked over the teacup of the master's house because of her carelessness in someone else's house, and she was very ashamed for a while. It's all my fault, I was distracted again just now. Distracted? She didn't look like she was distracted. And when he went to pick up the tea that Tanger served, it was clearly as if he had touched some sore spot and scalded it. Zhang Xuning is not a person to fool now, stared at her for a moment, and only said, "You come here." Yu Fangyan was a little scared and didn't dare to move. Zhang Xuning only stretched out her hand to her, and still said, "Come here." Yu Fangyan finally walked over. Zhang Xuning lowered her eyes, didn't look at her, and pulled the hand she was holding just now, and suddenly saw that there was an opening on the tip of her finger, and the outer skin on the finger was turned up, revealing the flesh inside. Although the wound was not big, it hurt to look at it. Yu Fangyan subconsciously wanted to withdraw his hand. She was embarrassed enough, but she didn't want to be seen by the second girl in front of her, who had already helped her a lot, and cringed and said, "I was so happy to go back yesterday, I accidentally fell on the steps of the house, and I stroked my hands, it's no big deal." Zhang Xuning held her hand hard and didn't let her pull this hand back. Fell? This Yu Fangyan looked stupid. It was indeed impossible for such a thing as walking and wrestling to happen to her. But she didn't even say a word, she only opened her long sleeves that wrapped her arms tightly, and on her arms, which already had a lot of mottled scars, the old wounds had not yet healed, and they turned out to be blue, purple, red, and many new wounds. Tanger and Lianer next to them gasped when they saw it, and they couldn't bear it. Yu Fangyan lowered her head deeply. Zhang Xuning finally slowly raised her head and looked at her again, and only asked, "Yesterday, your second sister Yu also returned from the palace, right?" Chapter 37, The Godmother of the Immortals. When she heard the word Yu from Zhang Xuning's mouth, Yu Fangyan's first reaction was surprise, because she didn't know how she could guess so accurately. But just a moment later, this surprise turned into horror. The owner has helped her too much. She didn't want to cause any more trouble to her owner. Not to mention, this person is still her sister Yu, who is difficult to deal with, and she came back yesterday and said a lot of unpleasant things. You must not let the second girl know. At that moment, she slowly and forcefully withdrew her palm from Zhang Xuning's hand, and said with a smile, "No, my injury has nothing to do with the second sister, it's all my own carelessness. It doesn't matter if it's a small injury, just take care of it for a few days." Zhang Xuning leaned on the pillow and looked at her. The scrutiny under a pair of eyes rarely became a little sharp, and she said slowly, "I just asked if your second sister had come back, and I didn't say that your second sister caused your injury. Why are you in such a hurry to defend her?" Yu Fangyan realized that she had leaked the stuffing in a hurry, and her ability to lie was not good, let alone lying to her life-saving benefactor. She became embarrassed for a while, and snorted, "Because Fangyan knows that the second girl is really good to me, I am afraid that the second girl will misunderstand and have a discord with the second sister. After all, I heard that the second girl and my second sister are both in the palace for the princess to read, and they should get along well if they look up and don't look down. My second sister is very powerful. Terrible? Was pressed into the fish tank by her, and she didn't dare to refute the awesome of two sentences. Zhang Xuning laughed in her heart, her eyes moved slightly, and she suddenly asked, "Are you afraid that I will take care of this matter, offend your sister, and have a hard time in the palace?" Yu Fangyan was stunned for a moment, and after a long time, he slowly lowered his head and said, "Yes." Zhang Xuning was silent. Yu Fangyan was afraid that she would be angry or sad, so she hurriedly explained in a panic, "My second sister likes her father and grandmother very much at home, and her temper is not very good. I heard that on the day of the Double Ninth Festival, even Yan Shizi and His Royal Highness the King of Linzi from the Marquis of Yanji Mansion came, and the painting she painted was also ordered by Her Royal Highness the eldest princess in the palace as the first, which must have been very liked by Her Royal Highness the eldest princess. If there is a conflict between the second girl and my second sister because of my misunderstanding, Fang Yin really doesn't dare to think about it, and she can't help it." Zhang Xuning almost laughed out loud. This girl really didn't understand the situation, as if she regarded Yu Yu as the most terrible and powerful person in her life, and she looked like she was afraid that she would be bullied by Yu Yu, so she was so compromised and swallowed her anger. A living gas bag. It's a little annoying to watch. But from the bottom of my heart, I want to defend her, and I would rather endure this grievance myself than let her know that Yu Yu is in the mansion to be powerful, lest it affect her. Zhang Xuning and Yu Yu's grudge is really not bad. At this moment, her slender fingers lightly put on the corner of the case, slowly turned around, and suddenly counted on her mind. The eyebrows that were originally raised slowly lowered down. As if she remembered something unbearable, she sighed faintly, and there was a trace of bitterness on the corner of her lips. "That's right, your second sister is very favored by Her Royal Highness the eldest princess, very powerful, very powerful." Yu Fangyan was still nervous, afraid that Zhang Xuning would provoke Yu Yu, but when she saw her suddenly depressed demeanor, she chuckled in her heart and blurted out, Did she bully the second girl?" Zhang Xuning held on to the corner of the case and buried her head. One hand slowly clenched where Yu Fangyan could see, and said, "Just the night before yesterday, when I was still in the palace, we were talking about an adult in the previous dynasty, and I was talking, and I don't know which sentence angered her, so she asked me to go to her side. I passed, but I didn't expect that she would suddenly move and me so fiercely. At this point, I was already a little choked. I can't go any further." God knows she hadn't pretended in a long time, and she almost laughed just now. At this moment, he only buried his head, not letting Yu Fangyan see his expression, and quickly raised his hand to wipe the corner of his eye that did not have half a tear at all. Tanger and Lianer in the house glanced at each other. Is our girl's weak painting style a little wrong? She didn't finish her words, but the effect was even better than when she finished speaking. It simply left an infinite reverie. What the hell did Yu Yu do to her? Yu Fangyan's mind was full of this question suddenly, and she remembered her rescue in a desperate situation in Yu Mansion that day, and she remembered that she cried yesterday but gently hugged her arms, and she also remembered what Zhang Xuning said that day. That sentence she still doesn't dare to forget. In order to save her, the second girl gave up her biggest reliance in this life. But now her second sister is not only bullying her, but also bullying the second girl. The fingers hanging at his side and clenched in his sleeves are quietly clenched. Yu Fangyan's eyes suddenly turned a little red. Her body trembled slightly, but this tremor was very different from the previous tremor. It was because of fear, and at this moment, although the fear did not dissipate, it was added to an unwarranted anger. Jiang Xuning raised her head at this time, turned her eyes to look at her again, raised the corners of her lips, and smiled at her. The more brilliant it is, the more dazzling it is in Yu Fangyan's eyes. Jiang Xuning stretched out her hand to pull her to sit down, with a deep smile in her eyes, but she just comforted her gently. Alas, it's all my fault, why do you mention this in a dignified manner? After all, a person like me who is not favored at home and has no noble's liking in the palace, naturally cannot be compared with your second sister. I guess I inadvertently committed some taboo against her. Where in the palace is there anyone who is not wronged? I just endure it, and it will only be half a year. Yu Fangyan sat down, but her eyes were lowered, and her body did not relax for a moment, but tightened even tighter than before. Jiang Xuning sent Tang Erlianer out first, and pretended to be relaxed. Look at me, I forgot to talk about business when I patronized your injuries. You have a lot of money in your hands now, and you can barely be considered a small businessman. I heard that in the past month or so, there has been a salt farm owner from Sichuan, whose surname seems to be Ren and his name is Ren Weizi, who has been running outside, wanting to raise a sum of money to go back to continue developing his family's salt farm. Many people know that their salt farm has been boiling salt for more than 100 years, and there has long been no salt brine underground, so even if the small boss said that he was willing to give dividends to the salt farm in the future according to the proportion of everyone's money, everyone was unwilling to vote. But the boss also said that he had invented a new tool that could drive deeper into the salt well. The famous salt works of the Great Qian dynasty were basically in the south. But the exception is artesian wells in Sichuan. This is the largest salt pan outside of the sea. When people dig wells from certain places, salt brine gushes out of the wells. After drawing brine from the ground, it is just set up a pot to burn near the salt well, dry the brine, filter the brine, and finally fry the salt. The salt thus produced is called well salt. The well salt of Shu is marketed in the north and south, and it is very famous, so in the artesian well, there are hundreds of salt farms of all sizes that make private salt, and the imperial court can't control it. Ren Weizi's ancestors have been running the salt factory for 3 generations, and it happens to be the 4th generation that has been passed on to him. But how can a well withstand hundreds of years of exploitation? The salt wells in Shu are all big shallow wells, and a well can only be drilled so deep, at most the well can only be dug a little bigger, in order to get more salt brine. However, as the salt brine is absorbed, the height of the brine gradually decreases, and eventually it drops below the depth of the salt well, and then no more salt brine can be extracted anyway. Salt wells will become waste wells. The salt works will also decline. What Ren Weizi took over was such a salt farm that was about to decline, and the long-term workers walked away, scattered, and the huge family business collapsed. It is difficult to accept that people are suddenly faced with such pressure in a desperate situation. So for the next 2 years, he squandered gold and silver, drank to kill his sorrows, and spent his days sitting on an empty salt pan with nothing but a ruined well. But one day, he fell over the jar. I didn't pay attention to it and pressed it down. The ground was hard dirt, and as soon as he pressed it down, the fragments of the jar slowly dug into the soil. So in such an instant, he was in the midst of all kinds of difficulties and the darkness of his heart, and a flash of inspiration. Ren Weizi suddenly stopped drinking, didn't even go out of the door, locked up at home all day long, bought all kinds of construction books, and spent a full 3 months concentrating on research and drawing several complex drawings. But at this time, he had no money. There weren't many people around who were willing to lend him money. Ren Weizi had no choice but to go to Beijing in person to ask a friend of his former father for help, but when his father's friend heard that he was coming, he was very hospitable and willing to lend him some small money, but to say that he wanted to borrow thousands of taels, he shirked in every way. Ren Weizi worked hard in Beijing for 2 months, but he was finally disheartened. He was concerned about the salt works at home, and had no choice but to release the news to other salt merchants in Beijing that he had developed a new tool to mine waste wells, hoping to use the dividends of the salt works in the future as a thank you to raise a sum of money and hurry home to implement his plan. This new tool is the famous Zhou Tsutsui. In the last life, Jiang Xuning heard this story in the palace. When Shen Zhu summoned the ministers of Shu, Ren Weizi had been hanged in the salt field at home for 3 years. He did raise a sum of money from the capital to go back. After returning to Sichuan for a long time, he also made this Zhou tube well, but he was unlucky. On the first night of the trial of Zhou tube well, he hit the deeper flame of the salt well, and there was an open flame of lanterns outside at that time. The flame surged, and it immediately burned with the open flame. The entire salt works were destroyed. The first Zhoutsu well made of Nanzu also collapsed in the fire. What's more, several long-term workers were injured in the fire. The merchants who had lent him money almost immediately came to his door and demanded that he pay it back. Ren is exhausted for Zishan. The salt farm was destroyed, Zhoutsubo was gone, not only to pay money to Changgong to treat burns, but also to compensate the merchants for the principal invested in him according to the contract made at the beginning, and sold the ancestral house handed down from the family in desperation. And on the day when all the debts were paid, a hemp rope hung himself on the Zhou tube well that only left the wreckage of the salt farm, ending his bumpy life and passing away. 3 months after his death, the drawings left in the box were found. 4 months after his death, a second Zhou tube well was built, and it successfully drilled a deep well of more than 20 zhang into the ground, and extracted the salt brine hidden in the waste well at a depth of 20 zhang, which had never been encountered before. A year after his death, Zhou tube well has become an indispensable tool for brine mining in the small deep well of the artesian salt field. 3 years after his death, wherever there is a salt pan in the artesian well, his portrait will be enshrined. In other words, the Zhou tube well invented by Ren Weizi can be used to mine salt brine deep in the formation, but he was unlucky and did not survive the most difficult time. Jiang Xuning still remembers that when Yu Fangyan in the previous life talked to her about her self-made experience, she also lamented that she had missed this great opportunity, because she didn't know that Ren Weizi was raising money in Beijing back then. She also said something like drilling technology and gas. Jiang Xuning couldn't understand these strange things. But she knows the ins and outs of this matter, and she also knows how many heart-wrenching twists and turns will be in between. You must know that it is not so easy to do one thing, and you may experience a lot of despair in the middle, but you can grit your teeth and hold on to it to know that the willows and flowers are bright in another village. Jiang Xuning stared at Yu Fangyan and told her a meaningful story. Since this Ren Weizi dared to borrow so much money and said that he could mine the waste well, presumably this Zhou tube well will definitely be usable. If he has enough money to seize the opportunity to buy the waste well that is not needed by other salt farms, and then use the Zhou tube well to obtain brine salt, God knows how much he will do. What kind of salt mining is this? Yu Fangyan was a little confused when he heard it. But this did not prevent her from understanding the key to Jiang Xuning's words. And that's: this Ren Weizi is a capable person. If you throw money into him, even if you may lose a lot in the middle, as long as you grit your teeth and hold on, you can open a new sky. Jiang Xuning knew that she had at least understood the most critical part. Her eyes turned slightly, and when she remembered Yu Yuelat, she reminded Yu Fangyan with a worried look, "You know, it's not easy for me to get the news this time, don't go around saying it again. This time is different from the last one. The last time I sold silk, this time I had to go through a difficult process, and if something happens in the middle, maybe I have to put all the money into it. This is a long-term business, and the torture in the middle is not something that ordinary people can bear. If someone who can't hold his breath knows that he has invested money on impulse, and in the end he can't even get his money back, isn't it hurting others? Yu Fangyan's clenched fists did not let go, and when he heard Jiang Xunning's words, a crazy thought suddenly popped up in his mind. But she didn't say it. Seemed to be thinking about something at the moment, nodded slowly, and said, Fangyan, remember. Jiang Xuning said, I have instructed you all the things that should be instructed. You have been out long enough today, and there is such a powerful sister at home, I don't dare to keep you any more, I'll send you out. Yu Fangyan got up and saluted. Jiang Xuning got up and stepped on the embroidered shoes, sent her to the door, and then stuffed a medicine bottle into her hand. This is medicine for you, apply the wound well, and it will be fine soon. Yu Fangyan's tears almost fell, you treat me so well. Jiang Xuning laughed at her stupidly in her heart, but stroked the top of her head and said, knowing that I treat you well, treat yourself better. By the way, I made so much money last time, but don't let your second sister know. Otherwise, I don't know how to inquire about your way of making money. She bullied me, after all, it was in the palace, and I would put up with it no matter what. But you're in the house, I'm really afraid that you have something to do under her. I know you want to defend me in your heart, but don't let me have some conflict with her. Tanger and Lianer were standing outside, and they were really familiar with what they said. Isn't this what Yu Fangyan said just now? Yu Fangyan didn't notice this at all. Hearing her words, her body trembled, her eyes were red, but her head was buried deeper, and she only replied in a low voice, yes. Jiang Xuning looked relieved at this time, and asked someone to send her out of the house. Yu Fangyan came out of the side door, and the carriage was still waiting outside. The coachman was already a little sleepy waiting, and when he saw her come out, he was shocked, and hurriedly asked, Miss, where are you going now? Yu Fangyan held the small medicine bottle in her hand, stood on the steps, and looked at it for a long time. There was no expression on his face. A wave of anger was stirring in her heart, so she only tightened her grip on the medicine bottle again, and said word by word, go to Qingyuan Bafo. Yu Fangyan walked on the front foot, and Jiang Xunning's previous weakness that I saw pitiful was suddenly dispersed. She snorted softly and clapped her hands lightly. The speed of changing her face before and after made Tanger Lianer stunned. It is not easy for a person who is cowardly by nature to correct it. But it's not impossible. Jiang Xuning was also a person who could coax men in her last life, but now she just uses the means of coaxing men to coax women, and the effect is so immediate anyway. Although she wanted to teach Yu Fangyan to do business and make more money, her situation in Bafa was too bad to do these things with peace of mind. If you go outside, you must first settle inside. If the situation in the house is not solved, the business is not at ease. Yu is narrow-minded and vicious. Let's see if Yu Fangyan, a stupid girl, will give her another surprise. Lianer hadn't figured out everything that had just happened, but she felt that her whole head was dizzy. Girl, you. Just now. Jiang Xuning didn't want to explain, but said, it's not early, let's go see if the carriage is ready, we should also set off. Lianer suddenly couldn't ask anything more. This one sent someone to look at the carriage. On the other end, there was a subordinate from the house hurriedly carrying a basket of fresh pears over. His face was full of joy, and said, second girl. This is something sent by Lord Zhou of Jinyi Weizhou and Shizhihutong, saying that it is a Dangshan crisp pear that has just been transported from Anhui Express, and it has just been appreciated on it, and it is specially sent to you to taste. And the pears were in the basket, 12 or 13. All of them look soft and yellow, full and tender. Jiang Xuning saw it, and heard such a report, but her face changed slightly. Reward things from above. That should be Zhou Yinzi's lack of thousands of households. If so, I'm afraid that this evening, Yan Lin may not come. Seeing that she didn't react for a long time, Tanger cautiously asked, "Girl." Jiang Xuning came back to her senses and said, "A basket of pears is just a basket, just put it down." After she finished speaking, she lowered her eyes and walked back into the room, where she sat quietly. After a while, Lianer came back and said, "The car is ready. But the second girl, you don't seem to be very comfortable today, are you still going to the upper floor?" Jiang Xuning blinked and said, "Go ahead." What if? Chapter 38, Winter Thunder. Yesterday the weather was fine, and you could even see the sunset in the evening. But by the time Jiang Xuning went out of the mansion in a carriage today, the sky outside had become gloomy, and the clouds were dense in the low sky, and the cold wind after the beginning of winter had already had a bit of a biting taste. It looked like it was going to rain. The peddlers and pawns who were hawking in the streets and alleys had already hurriedly put away their stalls, and the once lively capital suddenly became much more empty and quiet. Only the occasional wind swept through the rows of houses with some withered leaves. There weren't a few guests left at the top of the building. On a day like this, there shouldn't be anybody. The cousin, who had been busy all day, leaned on the edge of the counter and wanted to say a few words to the shopkeeper, but he didn't expect that at this time, there was a sound of a carriage approaching outside, and it quickly stopped outside the building. The cousin was stunned for a moment, and then hurriedly ran out to greet him. "I saw that among the fallen leaves in the cold wind, the curtain of the car was opened, and the maid in the car came down first, and then tied the young lady with a cloak of ferret fur. The cousin has seen many officials and nobles in Beijing on this floor, but it is the first time to see such a good-looking girl. Look at this line, the background is only high, not low. Why is it necessary to go out in such weather?" The cousin welcomed the man into the door, hesitated for a moment, and then asked, "The girl is here?" Jiang Xuning glanced at the deserted downstairs lobby, then looked at the steps to the second floor, lowered her eyes, and said, "Pick a private room on the second floor, I'll wait for someone." The cousin immediately said, "Then please go upstairs." Jiang Xuning took someone upstairs by herself. In the corner of the street outside, Dayakan stood in the shadow of the swaying trees, only looking at the two doors that opened on the floor. The figure of the second girl Ning gradually disappeared above the stairs, and her brows slowly tightened. Asterisk. Today, Xiaowei rarely did not play the qin in the piano hall. Lu Xian leaned on an arhat bed in the house like an old man, and pushed the table that was originally placed upright crookedly, so that he could lie down more comfortably, eating the pastries just sent by Xing Fangzai in his mouth, but holding his account book for this month in his hand, and calculating how much he had earned this month. When he raised his eyes, he saw Xiaowei standing in front of the window looking at the sky, and he almost died of joy. How can people be retributed? Lu Xian sighed fakely, "Look at you, you know that you are squeezing me all day long, and you also asked me to pay for you to do things. But I didn't expect that this kind of thing like buying raw silk was taken first, and now there is such a big mystery, and I haven't come back yet, I must have seen something next. Alas, Xiejuan, I'm your god of wealth, you have to be nice to me in the future, understand?" Jian Shu stood diagonally behind him and rolled his eyes at him. Lu Xian seemed to have eyes on the back of his head, and said leisurely, "Sword book, your white eyes are not good looking. Gare at me again, and I'll let you follow me next time. Book of Swords. Forget it. Secretly with people such a drudgery, there is not even a person to talk to kill the boredom, and it is not good to be tortured into a chatter who can talk to himself without anyone to talk to. Endure the calm for a while. Xie Wei glanced back at Lu Xian at this time, and when he saw him lying on his back with his feet crossed, his brows frowned slightly, and he only said, "Believe it or not, I'll ask someone to throw you out now." "LV Xian. Okay, the big guy is here. Endure the calm for a while." He pursed the corners of his lips and sat up straight very reluctantly, but his face showed a somewhat intriguing expression. "Xiejuan, it's quite interesting, looks like a serious reader, but these two children around him are just called books and piano, but they have to add knife and sword." I pondered carefully. "You really have some danger hidden inside." Xie Wei replied calmly, "If I am not dangerous, will you serve me?" Lu Xian stroked his palms and laughed, Exactly. Thinking that there were so many capable people in the Hanlin Academy back then, Lu Xian was proud of his talents, and he could afford such a danger. Later, Xie Wei went home to mourn Ding Wei. He saw that everyone else was vulgar and incompetent, so he simply resigned and went back to Jinling to visit, which gradually caught his Xie Juan's Wei, a good Jinshi background, was actually tricked to do business. It's all tears when I think about it. Lu Xian sighed, "The road is long, I will go up and down to seek." When his voice fell, a report came from outside, "Daikon Gongzi is back." Lu Xian showed a speechless expression. Sure enough, a moment later, a young man in a blue suit appeared at the door of the Qin Hall, walked in from the outside, stepped on the ground, barely made a sound, bowed down and said, "I have followed someone." Lu Xian was suddenly shocked, his eyes were shining, and he hurriedly asked, "Who is the owner behind you, Fang Yin?" But I didn't expect Daikon to answer. He just raised his eyes and looked at Xie Wei, and there was a rare hesitation in his eyes. Xie Wei realized that the person who followed Daikon might be a little unusual. "Let's talk about it." Daikon then said, "That subordinate is a long story short. At first, I obeyed Mr. S orders, and only went to Qing Yuanbo's mansion to see the situation, and waited outside for a long time, thinking that Miss Yu would not go out of the house again today. But I didn't expect that when Chen Zheng was in the house, she quietly came out of the house, dressed like a subordinate in the house, brought silver tails, first went to a silk village in Dongxi to buy a good Hangzhou silk, it seems to be the material of the cloud crane pattern, and then went to buy the pen and ink in the study. There are 2 pens, but the subordinates who are too far away do not see clearly what kind of pen it is, and Xie Wei. LV Xian. Jian Shu, who was standing on the side, secretly stroked his forehead, gently tugged the sleeve of Daikon, and lowered his voice to remind, "Long story short." "Oh." Daikon then remembered that he had made a mistake, nodded his head, and decided to accept the suggestion and put it in a more concise way. "She bought a lot of things, including Hangzhou silk, pen and ink, and even some rouge gouache for her daughter's home. Then I also went to the temple to incense. There are many people today, and there are many pilgrims who make incense. I followed her and was accidentally seen by the monk of the guest, and donated 2 taels of sesame oil money. Yu Fangyan seemed to have donated it too, and after entering, she asked for a peace charm in the hall." LV Xian. Book of Swords. Xie Wei raised his hand and slowly pressed his eyebrows, and only said, "Tell the point." Daikon suddenly felt a little aggrieved in his heart, and he didn't feel that he had talked a lot at all. Shouldn't the tracking be reported so carefully? He pursed his lips and said sullenly, "Second Miss Ning." Jian Shu's eyes suddenly widened, revealing a somewhat incredulous expression, and at this moment, he almost subconsciously turned his head to look at Xie Wei. Xie Wei stood in front of the window, silent. Lu Xian was confused when he heard this, and he didn't know who this Ning Er girl was, and he was almost angry with Daikon, that's not what you said when you said the point. How did this person get involved with you, Fang Ian? Is it her owner? What do you have to do with her? What have you seen? No, who is Ning Er girl? Dayakan, are you stupid? Who knows who it is just by saying a name? Although there are not many people with the surname Ning in the capital, there are not many of them. Which one is this? You dash. A whole bunch of problems have grown like mushrooms. Lu Xian's mouth was gushing. It was only after this big question was almost thrown out that he suddenly saw that the expressions of the three masters and servants in the house were wrong, and his heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly realized that things were not simple. The second Miss Ning, he said, you all seem to know who it is. Boom! A muffled thunder rolled across the sky. In this bleak late autumn and early winter, a heavy rain fell from the sky, and the brush quickly covered the entire capital. Huge raindrops fell down on the calm surface of the small lake outside the Qin Hall, and also smashed on the lattice work in front of the nearby window, splashing a small mist. Xie Wei turned his eyes and stared, and only said slowly, "It's raining." Asterisk. There was a burst of winter thunder, and the light blue lightning pierced the low-hanging twilight, and also illuminated the dim study of the Yanji Marquis mansion at this moment. The shelves of books were piled high, but when this lightning flashed, it left a deep shadow, showing a mountain-like depression. On the candlestick in the corner, the candle flame was blown and swayed by the wind. The contours of Yan Lin's handsome face were also illuminated by the shaking light and shadow, showing an unprecedented coldness. Zhou Yunzi sat calmly across from him. He has just been promoted to Jinyi Weiqianhu, and it can be said that he has the qualifications to touch the core of Jinyi Wei's power, and he has completely jumped to a superior with a head and a face. It's just that it didn't come very well. But what does that matter? Zhou Yunzi felt that he had never been a righteous gentleman, and all the means in the world, but everything that could achieve the end was a good means. The newly given embroidered spring knife on his waist had already been untied and placed on the table at the door, and he was wearing a dark black flying fish suit at the moment, and he only said to Yan Lin, "Zhou is greedy for power, and his heart is full of fame and fortune." Therefore, although he knew about this matter early, before he saw the benefits, he was entrusted with the heavy responsibility of Jinyi Wei, and he did not dare to say it to the prince. Until the second girl recommended me to the prince worked hard to find a position for Zhou to win 1,000 households. Zhou is a villain, and the villain is in harmony with profit. That's why today, everything is revealed to the son of the world. Investigating the Yanji Marquis mansion is a secret order of Jinyi Wei. Who in the world doesn't know that Jinyi Wei only listens to the saints? Who suspects that the Yanji Marquis mansion is also related to the case of Pingnan Wang's rebellion against the party in Beijing this time, and it is clearly revealed. Even if Zhou Yunzi is 1,000 households, he just obeys the orders from above, and it is dangerous for him to have no power. He knew that this matter was a bolt from the blue for the prince of the world, and even for the entire Yanji Marquis mansion. So looking at Yan Lin's expression, he didn't have any persuasion. At that moment, listening to the thunder and heavy rain outside, he only said slowly, "If the Marquis mansion of Yanji has no connection with the rebel party of King Pingnan, since Yanji is favored by the prince, he will naturally not do anything to fabricate evidence to frame the Ho mansion. You may not believe it, but these days, in the Xiaomi Ho mansion, I found that the Ho Yet and the remnants of the Pingnan Wang and his party did have correspondence. I don't know if the prince knows about this." Yan Lin listened, only in a trance. How could my father be connected to the remnants of the Pingnan Wang's party? The fingers resting on his knees clenched slowly, and he slowly closed his eyes and asked, "Since you have found out, when will you report it?" A Zhou Yunzi can find out today, and he can also find out a Zhao Yunzi and Wang Yunzi in the future. And maybe it will be more and more terrifying than Zhou Yunzi's findings. The heart of the emperor, who can guess? Yan Lin is also a person who has walked in the palace, and under the influence of his ears and eyes, he also knows that it is impossible to completely suppress this matter. All you can do is prepare in advance. Zhou Yunzi looked at the young man who was about to be crowned in only 1 month, and suddenly felt that he didn't seem to be as naive as he thought at the beginning, and he was easy to trust others. On the contrary, this son of the world thinks much more than his peers. He then remembered Zhang Xuning, and only replied, 7 days later, it will be submitted truthfully. Yan Lin burst out laughing. The things related to Zhou Yunzi before and after, all came up from the depths of his mind at this moment, and the piles were tightly matched. What was unreasonable before the rain has become reasonable after today's conversation, including Ning Ning's previous words. The more he laughed, the more he couldn't stop it, and at the end of the day, he couldn't help it, and a strange sourness came up. Zhou Yunzi just sat there and watched, as calm as a mountain, and didn't move, only his eyes were flickering, as if he had a little imperceptible admiration for the young man in front of him, but he seemed to be indifferent and didn't make waves. The bell rang outside. Zhou Yunzi said everything he should say, so he got up from his seat and only bowed to Yan Lin. Zhou is just a nobody, and he has no ability to turn the clouds and rain in the court. Everything is to obey orders, and I hope that the son of the world will not blame. It rained heavily every night, and Zhou had to go home, so he didn't dare to bother the prince anymore, so he retired. Yan Lin looked up with blank eyes, and only said, Qing Feng, send it to Zhou Qinhu. Qing Feng stood outside the door and answered. Zhou Yunzi saluted, picked up the saber he had untied earlier from the table, and then went out, took the umbrella from Qing Feng's hand, and said, Don't dare to work. Then he walked out along the corridor and was led out by Qing Feng. Chapter 39, The Reign of Reunion. Zhou Yunzi left. Yan Lin sat in the study for a long time. Qing Feng asked outside, Shizi? Over there. Yan Lin slowly covered his face with his palm and asked him, Is my father back? Qing Feng was stunned for a moment, and replied, Master Ho should be in Chengqing Hall. Yan Lin got up, went straight out of his study, and strode in the direction of Chengqing Hall along the corridor full of rock eyries next to it. Outside, the rain was pouring down. Even when walking under the porch, the cold wind blows on people with cold rain. Qing Feng was really startled, and only reacted when he saw that everyone had walked several feet away, and hurriedly took an umbrella and chased after him, Lord Shizi, umbrella. The Chengqing Hall of the Yanji Marquis Mansion is the place where the current Yanji Marquis Yan Mu, that is, Yan Lin's father, lives. As soon as Yan Linke approached, the old housekeeper outside showed a smile on his face. The prince is here, the next person has just sent 2 jars of good wine, and the Hoya has already opened it, and he is thinking about who to drink for a while in this rainy weather. You came just in time. Yan Lin didn't respond, and his footsteps didn't stop. The old housekeeper was a little stunned for a moment, looked back at Yan Lin's back when he entered, and couldn't help but ask Qing Feng, who came over, What's wrong with the prince today? Yan Jiho Yan Mu, who is now in his 40s, has some grey hair on his head, but it is not obvious. After all, he was born in the army, led soldiers, and fought in battles, and even at this age, his body still looks very strong. The beard on his chin is hard, and there is a bit of heroism between his eyebrows and eyes, and a scar on his forehead can be vaguely seen. This is all left over from the war. At this moment, as the old butler said, he had just opened a jar of wine. There are some side dishes on the table. The freshly opened wine was poured into the cup. The aroma of the wine and the aroma of the dishes diffuses in the humid air. Seeing Yan Lin come in, he laughed, his chest was shaken with full of middle energy, and he only said, "Didn't you say that you were going out today, why did you come over?" Yang Yuhao pointed to the wine cup on the table. Yan Lin stood still in front of the table, stared at his father fixedly, pursed his lips as if he was suppressing something, and then raised his hand to pick up the wine, and actually drank it all. The teenager who has reached the crown rolls the Adam's apple. A glass of liquor poured into the throat and burned from the lips and teeth all the way to the heart and lungs. With a snap, the wine cup was put down heavily. Yang Yuhao knows his son very well, and he can be said to talk about everything on weekdays, and he knows how much this kid likes the girl in Zhang Shilang's mansion, but he has never seen such a look. So, he realized that something was wrong with him. Yang Yuhao looked him up and down and laughed, "What's the matter, you have a conflict with that little girl in Xuaning?" Yan Lin didn't smile, and the gaze that fell on his father didn't look away, he only asked, "Father, do you know that the Holy Lord is sending Jin Yi to investigate the case of the remnants of the South King of Pingnan?" Yang Yuhao's original action of serving wine suddenly stopped. He raised his head and met Yan Lin's sharp gaze, and the young man's sharp edge all came out from these eyes, so that people had nowhere to hide. However, after pondering the meaning of his words, Yang Yuhao suddenly understood something in this moment. There was no panic. There are no surprises either. He actually laughed at once, and then laughed out loud, as if he recalled some absurd past, and couldn't help but stroke his hands and shake his head, and when he spoke, he actually had a kind of bitter hatred and madness. 20 years have passed, and I can't forget them, and I can't forget them who have done bad things. Ha 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 ha. Asterisk. Why did the Marquis of Yanji have correspondence with the remnants of the party of King Pingnan? Obviously, 20 years ago, when the King of Pingnan and the Tianjiao rebelled against the rebellion to the capital and killed the palace, the Marquis of Yanji was still a loyal minister like Qin Gong, and made a great contribution to quelling the chaos. In the last life, there are still some mysteries that have not been solved. A long time has passed since the appointed hour, and Yan Lin still hasn't appeared. Zhang Xuaning's heart slowly sank to the bottom. Originally, if she hadn't been selected to be a palace companion, she would have told Yan Lin a few days ago, but this group of people got involved and tossed, disrupting all her plans, and there were many people in the palace, so she didn't have a chance to speak clearly. And now, Yan Lin should already know, right? Standing in front of the window of the private room on the second floor, she stared at the rain outside. It's been a long time. It's a big down. The sky had gradually darkened, and lights were lit all over the capital, and the warm yellow light illuminated the windows of the houses, as well as the buildings near and far, but the outlines were blurred in the splashing rain and hazy rain and fog. The wind was biting. Tang Lianer, who was following her, saw that the wind was strong, and she couldn't help but be a little worried, so she stepped forward to close the window first, and couldn't help but complain, "The prince didn't come so late, maybe something couldn't be delayed, right?" Zhang Xuaning only said, "Don't close." The voice was gentle, but his eyes did not turn away, still falling on the glowing rain lines outside the window. Lianer and Tanger suddenly glanced at each other. "I always feel that today is a little unusual." The girl who never took the initiative to ask the little Marquis to come out asked the little Marquis to come out, and the little Marquis who was never late didn't come at this time. But they didn't dare to ask more. Zhang Xuaning said don't close the window, and the hand they stretched out had to retract, and tried to persuade her not to stand by the window. "Why don't you go and sit inside, the slaves and maids will help you watch, and the little Marquis will tell you when he comes. The wind is so strong by the window, your body and bones are not good, if one accidentally blows the cold and suffers the cold, the slaves and maids really can't afford it. Jiang Xuning didn't move as if she hadn't heard it. Lianer Tanger didn't dare to persuade any more. The private room suddenly fell silent again, and only the noise of the rain around me could be heard, mixed with the occasional sound of staggering from the nearby restaurants and inns. The sound of horses' hooves pierced through the rain with the sound of wheels. Lianer Tanger was shocked. Looking down from the window, the carriage was not the carriage of the Marquis of Yanji's mansion, nor did it stop under the floor, but stopped at the dust-washing pavilion across the street. A subordinate got out of the car first, and he respectfully held up an umbrella and welcomed the people in the car down. Dressed in a dark green robe, he frowned, and didn't seem to like such a rainy day. The facial features are also good, but a pair of eyes are too deep. The corners of his lips always seem to be hooked with a smile, but when he looks at people, he is not sincere, and even has a natural coldness. Jiang Xuning stood by the window and recognized it almost at a glance. It's Chen Ying. The well-known cool official of this dynasty, the current squire of the criminal department, is also the person who almost asked for Zhang Sha's life in the previous life. How did he end up here? Jiang Xuning was stunned. I saw that Chen Ying was immediately welcomed into the dust-washing hall after getting out of the car, and after a while, there was a lively greeting in the closed window on the second floor, and even through the rain curtain, everyone could be heard calling Lord Chen enthusiastically. At this time, the cousin came in and changed the hot tea for Jiang Xuning. She asked, "It's so late, and it's such a rainy day, there are no guests on your floor, and the dust-washing hall opposite is lively." The cousin followed her gaze and forgot to glance out the window and laughed, "Oh, the other side. I heard that it was Lord Chen of the criminal department who invited him, and the people who went were all officials in the criminal department, and it was normal for him to be here. Last time, Lord Chen had just left with his front foot, and young Master Xie was attacked with his back foot, and Lord Chen felt unlucky, so he changed to eat in the dust-washing pavilion from then on. Is that so?" Jiang Xuning's gaze still fell on the swaying window sash of the figure opposite. I could see a figure approaching. Then the window outside was pushed open, and a room of wine and laughter came out, and Jiang Xuning could easily see the people in that room, each with a flattering face. She frowned suddenly, knowing that she could see others, and others could see her, so she turned around and asked Lianer Tanger to close the window. But just as soon as he turned around and wanted to speak, the scene behind the opening of the window of Zikan Xian opposite Fang Cai, like a scroll of paintings, suddenly returned to her mind and settled in one of the quiet corners. Her heart trembled slightly, and even her body seemed to stiffen for a moment, and with some strange hope, she turned around again, and looked into the opposite window again. There was a banquet in the dust-washing pavilion, and there was a jade plate on the table, and the people sitting next to the table were all court officials. As soon as Chen Ying came, he was invited to the top by everyone. After all, he is a high-ranking official among this cadre, and he is a cousin of the criminal department, and everyone raised their wine cups to persuade him to drink, and stood up and sat down for a while, which looked very lively. So that quiet corner seems out of place. Blocked by the carved sash, Jiang Xuning could only see his silhouette slightly blocked. He wore a navy blue muslin round-necked robe often worn by low-grade officials, with slightly wide sleeves, and gently pressed against the separated knees with the slender palms of the finger joints. Sit on a round stool with a straight back. Zhang Xia looked out at the continuous rain curtain. The bustle of the room behind him seems to be untouched, calm, and solemn, and has nothing to do with him. Even if he just glanced at such a silhouette that was really not complete and clear, Jiang Xuning could be sure. It's him. There will be no one else. Such a quiet gesture of watching the rain, so long has passed, so long, it is still deeply engraved in her memory, and she can't erase a trace. Master Zhang, you still like to watch the rain like this? At this moment, Zhang Xuning had a hot burst of tears in her eyes. Everything from the previous life was turned over in an instant. Under the pavilion in the heavy rain, it was he who stood at the foot of the steps and reached out to tear off the corner of the official robe that she had deliberately stepped on, and when he raised his head to look at her, the raindrops on his eyelashes were full of raindrops. In the Qianqing Palace in the afternoon, it was he who stood with his head bowed down, and when he lowered his gaze in front of her and did not dare to raise it, his palms slowly clenched the stiff arc. On the muddy post road, it was he who covered his injured shoulder, and when he stretched out his hand to her who had broken her foot, the slightly rolling Adam's apple, and the blood snaking on the ground. What is she not doing well? She wants to provoke such a good person by herself. Probably there is a devil hidden in her heart, who wants to dye the white black, stir up the pure, drag down the people who stand high on the temple, and struggle in the pain of the fireworks of the world. In this way, Fang Zhu is satisfied. In the last life, what she owed Yan Lin took revenge 10 times and 100 times back, but what she owed Zhang Xia was that she gave up her life, and she couldn't repay it. She is the magic barrier that Zhang Xiaking has not crossed in his innocent life. And Zhang Xia is the last corner of her dusty heart, the last corner of the unstained pure land. There were moments when she thought, if it weren't for the queen, she would be desperate to marry this person. From now on, raise your sleeves to brush every bit of dirty dust off his clothes, lean over him to pick up every stumbling rubble on the road ahead, become a good person, and enjoy his kindness to himself with peace of mind. But she is the queen after all. A heart that is blinded by the world harms himself and harms him. Zhang Xuning looked at the other side, and her vision slowly blurred, but she didn't know if it was because of the pouring rain or the upwelling tears. Someone hurried up from the downstairs of the dust-washing pavilion. Zhang Xia, who had been sitting under the window for a long time, finally moved. When the man had said something to him, he nodded, got up and said goodbye to the bystanders, and walked out through the open door, without looking at their faces. All the way downstairs, the cousin of Zikan Xian handed him an umbrella in front of the door, and he took it, stretched out the dark blue oil paper umbrella, and fought. When the edge of the umbrella is raised, the deep contour face is also exposed under the umbrella, from the cold chin, to the thin lips that are pursed, to the straight nose, and the calm and narrow eyes, and the long eyebrows that are slightly frowned. As if sensing something, his gaze lifted. So it just collided squarely. Through the curtain of rain and the long street, she was upstairs by the window, and he was downstairs in front of the steps. Under Zhang Xuning's eyes, a tear fell without warning. A drop of cold rain on the tip of the umbrella gently fell on the back of Zhang Xia's hand. He felt like he had been burned. The bright-looking girl, washed away from the lead, without the vague paranoia, was so clean and feminine, standing behind his favorite heavy rain, looking at him with a pair of eyes that were also raining. At this moment, the fingers holding the umbrella clenched hard. But he didn't walk over after all, nor did he show any abnormality, but after staring for a long time, he lowered his gaze and walked down the steps, letting the open umbrella cover all his secrets, and gradually drift away in her sight. Zhang Xuning then thought, it's good, nothing has happened yet. Chapter 40, Past Lives. Zhang Xia was born in the official examination. The official examination is different from that of the Jinji, and the officials who are selected after the examination are different from the ordinary officials who eat the king's money, and after being recruited into the public gate, they are used when things are urgent, and things are decided, which can be regarded as temporarily assisting the officials in the government. There are rules in this dynasty, and the officials cannot be the imperial history, nor can they participate in the scientific examination, so generally speaking, those who will participate in the official examination are people who have repeatedly failed the examination or come from a humble background. Zhang Xia belongs to the latter. He was young and sluggish, only raised by his widowed mother, although he was talented, but he was not very familiar with the 8 shares, economics, and arts, and strategy. Gu Chunfang therefore recommended him to the imperial court. In less than 3 years, because he made a judgment on a suspicious case in front of the emperor, he was favored by the saint and pointed to the criminal department. It's just that in the previous life, his future career was really not very smooth, full of ups and downs. Zhang Xuning felt astringent in her mouth when she thought about it. He could have gone down in history, with straight and right and away from the troubled battles of the court, but she was swept into it. When Zhang Xia was first promoted to the head of the criminal department, Jin Yiwei wanted to completely control the power of the prison, but Zhang Xia felt that Jin Yiwei acted arrogantly and abused lynching, and there was a conflict of power between the two divisions, so they were always for tat. Zhou Yunzi was born in charge of Bijin Fuzi. He was bent on eradicating Zhang Xia, and Zhang Xia was bent on recovering the power of prison, and repeatedly impeached Zhou Yin for bending the law for personal gain and corrupting the dynasty. The two are incompatible. Behind Zhou Yunzi is Zhang Xuning. She was fighting against the Xiao family at that time, and she has a lot of useful places for Zhou Yunzi, so looking at Zhang Xia at the beginning is like looking at a stumbling block. How to look at it is not pleasing to the eye. At the beginning, it was because of the difficult position. Later, I found out that this person was cold-faced, and it was really fun to tease. After all, she is the queen, but her words and deeds are excessive, and Zhang Xia can't afford to provoke her, so most of them put up with her and let her earlier, but she is not a person who accepts it when she sees it, but she is getting more and more inches. Zhang Xia often advised her with advice. Zhang Xuning was also held by everyone at that time, and she didn't take these words of advice in her eyes, but felt that this person was pedantic and stubborn. It wasn't until later that Xiao Shu and the Xiao family pressed forward step by step, and one day they took the evidence of Zhou Yin's party camp and took bribes, and once they all poked it out, and deliberately handed it over to the criminal department for trial, so that the case fell into the hands of Zhang Xia. The former dynasty is closely related to the harem. Xiao Shu is arrogant, her eyes are on the queen's position, and she is now pregnant. It will be great to give birth to the emperor's heir, if she is allowed to beat her own power in the previous dynasty and successfully get the back position, then Zhang Xuning can be regarded as a place without a place to be buried. After all, she fought so fiercely with the Xiao family before. She and Xiao Shu, no matter who gets the opportunity, will not let their enemies go unharmed. Overnight, Zhang Xuning suddenly reached a dilemma, and it seemed that she could only be killed. People always love to put the icing on the cake, but rarely give charcoal in the snow. The people who had gathered at the height of her momentum suddenly dispersed like a low tide. But Zhang Xuning didn't want to die yet. So, she chose Zhang Xia. On that day, Shen Ju summoned several ministers in the Qianqing Palace, including Xie Wei, and Zhang Xia, who was in charge of hearing the case, until the key to the palace gate was not finished, so he sent an edict to let several adults stay in the palace. Zhang Xuning stood under the long palace wall and waited. Her figure is covered by the shadow of the high wall. The little eunuch who led the way was holding a lantern in front of him, shining on the figures of the two people in front of him and behind him, and approached this side from a distance. The man in front was Xie Wei. It was probably because he got closer that he recognized her at a glance, and he actually stopped, and said, "I suddenly remembered that Fang Yupi was left in the cabinet in the morning. I'll go back and get it, and Lord Zhang will go first." With that, he turned and went back. One of the little eunuchs immediately lit a lantern and followed. At this time, Zhang Xuning walked out of the shadows and looked at the person who stayed in place. Lord Zhang, this palace has something to tell you. Zhang Xia didn't seem to expect her to be bold enough to dare to stop him in the middle of the night. Not to mention that there is Taishi Xie with him today. He lowered his eyes silently, and had already guessed her intention, and only said, Niang's request, forgive Zhang for his fate. The night is deep, and there are lonely men and widows. One is the queen and the other is a minister. Although Zhang Xia was upright, he was also afraid of accumulating and destroying his bones, and after saying this, he was about to bow down and retreat to avoid suspicion, but before he was about to walk away, Zhang Xuning reached out and grabbed his white official robe. The steps he took suddenly stopped. Her slender snow-white fingers rested on the dark embroidery, and she looked up at him slightly, and there was a slight tremor in her voice. Do you want to watch me die? Zhang Xia was speechless. Zhang Xuning's fingers were slowly tightened, and the transparent and round nails were bright red kodan, which had a thrilling glamour in the dark night, and she pleaded with him with a soft posture that she was not used to. The carriage turned out of the post road, and you would rather break your legs than protect me, Zhang Xia. If you are so good to me, can't you always be so good to me? At that moment, he hung his stiff palm on his side, slowly clenched it, and said, Niang is the mother of a country, and Zhang Xia is a minister of a dynasty. Eat the king's luck, and be loyal to the king. In distress, exchanging one's life for one's mother is a matter of Zhang Xia's responsibility. But the case of Zhou Yin's henchman was originally a state affair, and the rise and fall of one day were all tied to it, and Zhang Xia did not dare to show favoritism. They of the part. Zhang Xuning tugged at the corner of his sleeve robe, stubbornly refusing to let go, and when he heard this, he actually laughed, and looked straight into his eyes with a pair of eyes. Just ask, really? Zhang Xia finally avoided her gaze, and also closed his eyes. There seemed to be a struggle hidden in the rolling Adam's apple, and said in a deep voice, if Niang thinks that the minister's act of saving her in the past is really arrogant, and the minister is willing to be punished. Zhang Xuning slowly let go of her fingers. The corner of the sleeve was crumpled by her and hung down. She only said worriedly, I know that Master Zhang doesn't rub sand under his eyes, and these people in the court and China form a party for personal gain, and there should be a law to punish them. But do you know what will happen to me if Zhou Yin falls? I don't want to beg Lord Zhang to spare them for the rest of my life, but please ask Lord Zhang to raise his noble hand and let me get through this difficulty. In the future, I will bring all the crimes of these men before the great people, and they will confess their sins. Zhang Xia raised his steps to leave. Zhang Xuning didn't stop him anymore, just looked at his cold back that was about to disappear into the darkness, and told the biggest lie he had told in his previous life, Zhang Xia, you help me. After this time, I'll be a good person, okay? Zhang Xia stood in place for a long time. The sky was too dark, and although there was a hazy moonlight overhead, it was really difficult for her to judge what Zhang Xia was thinking at that moment. All she could hear was her own drumming heartbeat. That night, Zhang Xia finally left from under the long palace wall without saying a word. Xie Wei, who went to fetch the jade pendant, did not come back for a long time. Zhang Xuning stood at night until she was due and listened to the sound of the palace announcing the time, and then returned to Cunning Palace. Every day that followed was a torment for her. Until half a month later. In the case of Zhou Yin's henchmen taking bribes for personal gain, after the trial of the 3 divisions, the news came out that half of the people involved in the case had conclusive evidence and were dismissed and exiled according to their crimes or beheaded in the autumn, while the other half were spared because of the vague evidence and inconsistent confessions. And in the process of hearing this case, the Xiao family's formation of a party in the DPRK and China was also found out, which aroused Shen Ju's jealousy. Sha's plot fell short. Jiang Xunning's position was retained. On that day, she was really happy from the bottom of her heart, and she asked people one after another to inquire about when the court would go down in front of her, and even Zhou Yunzi didn't want to see her, just thinking about where to stop Zhang Sha for a while, and what to say to him. But she never expected that the person who came back to report would say that Master Zhang had been imprisoned. The earrings she was picking up to hang on her ears suddenly fell and shattered. Thousands of calculations can't be calculated, and people's hearts are fickle. Or, Zhou Yunzi is an immature wolf. In this crisis, she tried her best to keep her power and Zhou Yunzi. Unexpectedly, as early as when this matter was first discovered, Zhou Yunzi weighed the pros and cons, and didn't know when he switched to Xiaoshu and served Xiaoshu. Whether those half of the people are really innocent or not, Jiang Xuning doesn't know. She only knew that it was Zhou Yunzi who put forward conclusive evidence of these people's personal bribery after the end of the triage of the three divisions, which instantly put Zhang Shat, who had previously judged their innocence, into danger, and jointly impeached Zhang Sha for bending the law for personal gain, and falsely accused him of having an affair with the queen. Half a life is innocent, and after all, it will be tarnished. In the past, he was Jin Yiwei's sworn enemy, but once he fell into prison, how could he please him under Zhou Yunzi's hands? Not to mention that there was a fortat confrontation with Chen Ying, the right attendant of the criminal department, who was good at all kinds of torture. Jiang Xuning didn't dare to think about what kind of life he was living in prison. I don't dare to think that he will think that she is calculating him, after all, to get rid of him. She only knew that only half a month after Zhang Sha was imprisoned, the door of the house was raided, and the old mother, who had no one to take care of, was worried about the safety of her only son day and night, and finally fell ill and died. Zhang Sha is a well-known filial son. But in prison, he didn't even see her for the last time. According to legend, the cold-faced and cold-hearted Zhang Shilang cried in prison on the night he learned that his mother had died. He is upright, has solved countless cases, and has never made mistakes or omissions. Many of the people are famous. At that time, all the judges who tried Zhang Sha's case did not dare or were unwilling to write a conviction for him, and many of the people in the DPRK and China petitioned for him. But in the end, on the third day after his mother's death, he asked the prison servants to lay pen and ink, and then he took up the pen himself, stated his guilt word by word, wrote a convicting sentence for himself, and sentenced himself to capital punishment, which was scheduled to be beheaded after the autumn. The verdict was presented to three divisions, and half of the court was sighing. Looking back now, the pleading under the palace wall that night was actually the last time Jiang Xuning saw him. I don't know, Xie Wei in the previous life, did he do what he said? People have gradually walked away under the long street covered by the rain curtain, the wind poured in from the window, blowing into the cracks of people's bones. Jiang Xuning slowly withdrew her gaze, and finally felt a little cold. When he raised his hand to support his face, his eyes were full of tears. Zhang Sha, in the last life, I was the queen, I was a bad person, and I owed you a lot. In this life, I don't want to be a queen, I should be a good person. Is it a good match for you? Girl, what did you see, why did you cry? Seeing her standing in front of the window, not moving for a long time, Lianer Tanger came up to check, but was stunned by the tears on her face. Jiang Xuning smiled, took an embroidered handkerchief and wiped her red eyes, and said, "It's okay, the wind is too strong, it's just a blur." She asked the two girls to close the window, and when Yan Lin was a little tired of waiting, she leaned on the chaise longue in the house to rest, and when she closed her eyes slightly, her heart was actually safe. He only said softly, "Wait for Yan Lin to call me." Both girls whispered, "Okay." "But it's so late, will Yan Shiza still come?"